Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Emergency Management Assistance Compact, Legal Considerations in 90 Minutes. This webinar put on by the CDC's Center for Preparedness and Response and the Public Health Law Program in collaboration with the National Governors Association and the American Bar Association. My name is Matthew Penn, and I serve as the Director of CDC's Public Health Law Program, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 4 webinars organized to focus on preparedness and response for public health emergencies. We did want to let you know that the recording for the first webinar in the series is now live at nga.org/webinars. That's WEBINARS. This 90-minute session will be led by representatives from states participating in the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC, as you all know it. Our speakers will explain the mechanisms and requirements states can use to request and supply aid under EMAC. The second part of this webinar, they will discuss the liability protections for volunteers acting as, quote, agents of the state, end quote, and identify states who have extended protections to volunteers responding in emergencies. So by way of agenda and speakers, as I said, moderator, my name is Matthew Penn. I'm here at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We have a great panel up today. Angela Koppel with the National Emergency Management Association, Gregory Sunshine here at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Holly Welch with the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and originally we also had on the agenda Samantha Phillips with the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, but because of the storms in the Northeast, they have activated their Emergency Operations Center in Massachusetts, and she is occupied with a response. So as emergencies go, sometimes we are called to duty. So first up today, see if I can get this to move forward. Here's a picture of me. Okay, Angela Koppel. Our first speaker today is Angela Koppel. Angela Koppel is the EMAC Program Director at the National Emergency Management Association. Angela started working with NEMA in February 2005, just in time to work Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. She is considered to be one of the nation's experts on EMAC, as Angela has worked over 300 disasters, deploying over 119,000 personnel. Prior to joining NEMA, Angela managed a biotechnology-based investment fund for the state of Kentucky. When she isn't helping to coordinate EMAC response, Angela is talking about holistic dog health, one of her passion projects, or rowing. So with that, Angela, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, EMAC and mutual aid is heavily relied on in the United States. When states need assistance or can get assistance more quickly from another state, they turn to the nation's mutual aid system called EMAC. So EMAC is a state-to-state mutual aid agreement. It's utilized for services, personnel, equipment, commodities, basically anything that goes across state lines. EMAC is law in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Northern Mariana Islands. I am often asked, can this deploy through EMAC? And the answer is generally yes, if it's a state resource or if it can be cloaked as an agent of the state. Some states have laws that prohibit the deployment of private sector resources through EMAC, while other states are able to do so. As you can see, EMAC can be utilized for many different disciplines, We do encourage all resource owners to work with their home state emergency management agencies to determine eligibility. And I know that Holly's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Very briefly, I want to talk about EMAC's governance structure. Obviously, as a state-to-state compact, NEMA is a voting membership with oversight from the NEMA Board of Directors. A smaller group of state emergency management directors oversee the implementation of the compact through the EMAC committee. And the EMAC committee takes input from the EMAC advisory group, which is a national organization, national organizations from states across the nation, of which NGA and CDC are actually members of. They all work together to improve the compact, and the EMAC Executive Task Force are really kind of the worker bees within the states that help guide the policies, the procedures, and the implementation of the compact. EMAC is coordinated between the states and the federal agencies. Every year, one state takes on the role of the national coordinating state who's responsible for operations coordination at all levels. My slides seem to be randomly advancing. I apologize for that. Don't know how to get it back to where I was, but there we go. The national coordinating states works with teams deployed in the requesting states and liaisons at both the national and the regional FEMA coordination centers to work with the ESFs to coordinate the EMAC response. The foundation of EMAC is the law that's been passed by all 55 members and the implementation procedures that all states have agreed to follow. I'm going to review some, but not all of the EMAC Articles of Agreement. Usually when I get a question about the implementation of EMAC, the first thing that I do is I look at the law, and then I look at our procedures to see how we're applying that law. So EMAC Article 1 says a governor must declare a state of disaster or emergency before resources can be received through EMAC. And the compact can be trained and exercised without a declaration. Article 2 states that any resource one state has that they want to share with another may be deployed through EMAC. And again, we use those enabling mechanisms to do that. Article 1 also says that a state emergency management agency must implement the compact on behalf of the governor. And that's why within all 54 of the member states, it is implemented through the state emergency management agency. Article 3 identifies the state responsibilities to implement EMAC, including the development of plans, procedures, education, training, and more. Article 4 very clearly says that if a state resource is needed at home, they may withhold it. They don't have to share it if they need it themselves. Article 4 also says that personnel deployed through the compact, with the exception of law enforcement, who must be sworn in to have powers of arrest, have the same powers, duties, rights, and authorities as they do in their home state. While deployed on an EMAC mission, personnel are under the command and control of their home state leadership, but under the operational control of the requesting state or that requesting entity. Article 5 identifies all state-issued licenses, certificates, and permits are deemed licensed, certified, or permitted by the requesting state. There are, of course, differences in the standards of practice, and job titles might differ between jurisdictions and states, but those state licenses are recognized as state licenses once they come in. Article 6 states that for tort liability and immunity purposes, you're an agent of the requesting state so long as you are acting in good faith. Article 8 identifies the assisting state as responsible for providing workers' compensation and death benefits. And as a note, the law also states that workers' compensation and death benefit claims could not be billed back to the requesting state. Article 9 simply states that mission-related expenses will be reimbursed by the requesting state, including damage to equipment. EMAC reimbursement is not contingent on a federal disaster declaration. Of course, all expenses must be eligible and, of course, must be documented. I'm going to briefly go over the 5 phases of the EMAC process. The first stage is pre-event preparation. This is where you do everything you need to prepare for an EMAC deployment. So on the state level, this includes developing plans and procedures, conducting training and exercises. On the local level, it's working with the State Emergency Management Agency and understanding how EMAC is implemented within that state. And for first responder, it includes taking EMAC training and developing what we call a mission-ready package. Activation, quite simply, is the governor declaration, which is needed in order for resources to be able to come into that state. It is a requirement of the compact. I will say that EMAC follows the normal emergency management process within the state. So local requests go to the state determines how that resource request will be filled. In the assisting state, all the offers of assistance go up to the State Emergency Management Agency, and that is then coordinated between the 2 state emergency management agencies of the 2 states. It's a very efficient process, and it uses existing coordination procedures that states already have. The states utilize the EMAC operation system to request and offer resources. And they also complete the EMAC mission paperwork that constitutes a legally binding agreement between those 2 states for every mission that goes through the compact. The system is very fast and allows the states to complete the paperwork rather painlessly. Resources that deploy through EMAC are given an EMAC mission order authorization form during the mobilization phase, and they receive a pre-deployment briefing to ensure that they know where they're going, what they'll be doing, and who to contact should they need help. Once deployed, they are under the operational control of that requesting state until they demobilize and return home. Once they do return home, they need to gather up all their receipts, travel logs, equipment logs, and other documentation, submit it to their home state emergency management agency, who will compile the reimbursement package and send it to the home state. A lot of people think that the biggest delays in reimbursement are on the requesting state side, and most are surprised to discover that oftentimes the biggest delay is on the assisting state side. It's actually getting that reimbursement package compiled and then submitted to that state emergency management agency. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. And next up, we have Gregory Sunshine. Greg serves as a public health analyst with CDC's Public Health Law Program in the Center for State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support. Greg oversees research on topics including disaster and public health emergency declarations, Zika emergency response authorities, state Ebola monitoring and movement policies, isolation and quarantine, medical countermeasures, and the legal preparedness competencies. Greg travels to health departments teaching response personnel about the role of law in public health emergencies, and serves as the ASTO and NACHO on the ASTO and NACHO legal preparedness work groups. He has also published on topics such as gubernatorial emergency authorities, Ebola and the law, and tribal emergency declarations. In 2018, Greg was named as a fellow for the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security's Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Initiative. So with that, Greg, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
All right. Thank you all so much for having me. Happy to be here. Excited to discuss this topic. So what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily emergency management assistance compacts and some considerations for state legal issues that can be impactful on a state's ability to deploy personnel through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. Now, EMAC, as Angela described so wonderfully, is a tried and true structure or system that has been utilized by many times by many different jurisdictions for a lot of different purposes and a lot of different responses. And it provides both the legal structure, legal system, and also the technological and operational mechanism for deploying personnel and resources. There are other mechanisms states can use to send personnel across state lines, and there are some common statutes that states have adopted, like the Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioners Act, that addresses some of the issues I'm going to be describing in my presentation. But what I'm going to be focusing on in my presentation are not those issues in general, specifically liability, licensure, reciprocity, workers' compensation. What I'm going to be addressing is how do you leverage your state's laws to allow the use of the Emergency Management Assistance Compact mechanism to grant liability protection, well, licensure, reciprocity, and workers' compensation coverage for non-state personnel. Other statutes may do those things, but if they are acting outside of the EMAC structure, then you're not able to take advantage of the system of the processes that EMAC provides and just the general level of awareness and comfort that jurisdictions have with using EMAC as a tried and true mechanism that they have practiced many times across many different emergencies. So a little bit about where we work. I sit in the CDC's public health law program. Our mission is to advance the use of law as a public health tool. We do this through a bunch of different ways. We engage in legal epidemiology, which is the systematic scientific collection and analysis of laws across jurisdictions and across time to determine their impact on health outcomes. I do that specifically with emergency preparedness activities. We analyze emergency declarations, emergency response statutes, authorities provided to governors and other executive officials to see how law can be used as a tool to advance public health emergency response. We do a lot of training and workforce development, so obviously speak on webinars. I travel around the country doing trainings on public health emergency law for many different jurisdictions. And we also engage in a lot of partnership and outreach, and this includes engaging with attorneys for health departments on many different issues, connecting them to each other, including emergency preparedness and response. And this topic is something that I have heard a lot of different attorneys bring up through our engagement, through our partnership and outreach efforts. So we serve everybody. We serve CDC programs, we serve state, tribal, local, and territorial health departments, we serve members of the public, anyone who has an issue related to public health law, we are happy to be available. What we are not available to provide is legal advice, nor do we speak on behalf of the CDC. So I think that covers the disclaimer adequately. I won't read it out loud to you. Let's just jump right into it. So first, let's talk a little bit about the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. Angela provides such a great basis. I'm going to repeat some of the things that she said, but only to the extent that I want to focus in on certain aspects that are going to be relevant to the rest of the issues that I'm about to discuss. So, as Angela mentioned, EMAC is a congressionally ratified compact. Congress has approved it pursuant to the Interstate Compact Clause of the U.S. Constitution. It provides the form, the structure for states to engage in mutual aid, send personnel and resources to each other. Every state has ratified the compact, and as Angela mentioned, incorporated it into the law of their jurisdiction. And this is something that I just want to spend a little bit more time particularly speaking on because it's relevant. There are mutual aid agreements that states have entered into. They've signed on to them, but they are, agreements from that jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. What states who have entered into EMAC have done either by reference or specifically, have made the terms of EMAC statute in their law. Their legislature has ratified and made the terms of the Emergency Management Assistance Compact enshrined in their state's statutory structure. And that's an important consideration and something that is important to consider when we think about the legal basis and the legal tools that EMAC provides for deploying personnel. It includes not just the authority to deploy materials, but also people, and states that the party state who sends emergency forces to another jurisdiction, when they're operating within your state, they are going to be granted the same powers, duties, rights, and privileges as afforded to the forces of that state, as if they were employees of that state. But one thing to keep in mind is this language, where lawyers are always going to focus in on the particularities. It's emergency forces of any party state. It's state personnel, state resources. So we want to spend our time looking at how that might impact deployment and coverage under EMAC, and how states have looked to expand that coverage. So EMAC provides, as Angela mentioned, licensure reciprocity. That's great. People have to be licensed to engage in certain acts, and we want to make sure that they're able to engage those acts upon their deployment to another jurisdiction. It provides relief from civil liability. Wonderful. We don't want people to be sued for actions taken in good faith when they're engaged in deployment. And it provides workers' compensation protections. If you're hurt, we want to make sure you're covered because you were providing services for that emergency response. So here's EMAC's licensure reciprocity system. You've got a license. Some of the text got a little messed up in the conversion. My apologies. You've got a licensed personnel in a participating EMAC state, which is all of them and almost all of the territories. Very excited to hear the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands passed their legislation. That they're, I believe that makes them the newest member to EMAC. So very exciting. You've got a state that receives an emergency declaration. They've been affected by an emergency. They've activated EMAC. They request mutual aid. EMAC's language, and therefore the statute of the receiving state, recognizes the licensure from the sending state. Someone who's licensed in New York is now going to be deemed licensed in Florida if they're deployed through the EMAC mechanism. And that is a really fundamental tool to make sure that we have individuals who are capable and able and ready to provide really important technical services, which is what a lot of license actions tend to take the form of. Then EMAC provides liability protections for those deployers, and see the underlying language: officers and employees of a party state, of the state. That's important language to focus in on, are considered agents of the requesting state for tort liability and immunity purposes. So that's one particular nuance to discuss. They are saying that we're going to treat employees of another state as employees of our state, and we're going to extend to them the same liability protections we provide to employees of our state. Now, this means disaster liability protections if those are activated in that jurisdiction or present, have been passed by those jurisdictions. But that also means sovereign immunity protections. If the state has, let's say they've waived sovereign immunity through a State Tort Claims Act, but retain protections for state employees acting in their official capacity. Those protections for those state employees acting in their official capacity are going to be extended to employees of another state, officers or employees of another state who are deployed through EMAC. They're going to extend those state sovereign immunity protections. So those are very powerful liability protections, and it generally, allows the state to step in on behalf of the state employee and represent them and defend them in court, subject to certain conditions, including the requirement that they act in good faith. EMAC also goes above that extension of liability protections, and it includes a liability protection of its own. No party state or its officers or employees rendering aid shall be liable on any account or omission in good faith. So that means that your liability not only is going to be covered by the state's liability protections and the state's sovereign immunity protections, but also it's going to be limited to only actions. You can only be sued for actions that were not taken in good faith. Good faith does not include willful misconduct, gross negligence, or recklessness. And that makes sense. We don't want to be protecting individuals who are not acting in good faith from liability. But this is for those officers or employees of a party state who are deployed through the EMAC mechanism. And then we've got workers' compensation coverage. And this is an interesting nuance because unlike the liability protections, the worker, which put the onus on the receiving state to extend their liability protections to the deployed responder, the workers' compensation provision in EMAC says that the sending state, the home state of that employee, is going to provide for workers' compensation coverage for members who are deployed through EMAC as if the injury or death that occurred had been sustained within their own home state. And just from a practical, pragmatic perspective, that makes sense. Workers' compensation processes can take a lot longer. You don't want to spend your life dealing with the workers' compensation office in California because you were there for one day on a response and got injured as a result. You're going to just be dealing with your home state's workers' compensation process. But again, this is for those deployed state personnel, which gets to the issue of deeming authority. Particularly for folks on this call who are engaged in public health preparedness, we can imagine that there are a number of services that are really vitally important for emergency response that may not have folks in state employment that can provide those services, and that's a challenge. Let's say if we have a pandemic flu outbreak and we need lots of people in an affected state to provide vaccination. Well, there might only be so many people employed at the state level who are licensed to administer vaccines who could be deployed through EMAC. So a really vital tool that our next speaker, Holly, is going to speak to with her own personal experience, which you should take with a lot more weight than my own experience. What some states have done is use what's known as a deeming authority, either a statutory authority or through some kind of agreement to grant non-state personnel recognition as a state employee for the purposes of emergency response or deployment through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. Now, state deeming authority allows the state to, deem, to say you're a non-governmental personnel, but not an employee of the state, but we're going to deem you to be a state employee for specific purposes. This is a mechanism to give those state benefits to non-governmental personnel, the things that we've talked about: licensure, reciprocity, those governmental liability protections, workers' compensation coverage. This isn't something that's just limited to deployment of personnel. State deeming authority is something that states can use to activate and utilize volunteer sources from within their state as a person multiplier for their response. Now, the deeming authority can be something that's found through statutes. There can be statutes that provide these powers, and other jurisdictions can utilize agreements or contracts to deem non-state personnel state actors, thus making them deployable through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So in my remaining time, I want to click through and discuss some interesting example statutes that states have passed to deem non-state personnel governmental personnel for the purposes of extending these protections, in some instances specifically to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So here's an example from California. This is interesting because it's specific to governmental personnel, but it recognizes that local government personnel aren't, in the state of California, state employees or officers. So this is a statute that exists right after the EMAC language in state statute in California. So you've got your Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and the very next law right after that is this statute. And Part B states that local government or special district personnel who are officially deployed under the provisions of EMAC pursuant to an assignment from the state's Emergency Services Office shall be defended by the Attorney General or other legal counsel provided by the state and shall be indemnified subject to the same conditions applicable to state employees. So they're saying that if you're deployed through the Emergency Services Agency and you're a government employee, we're going to treat you as a state employee. We're going to give you those additional protections. Now, what's important to keep in mind, something to consider, is what agency has the authority to do this deeming. In this instance, it's an assignment from the Emergency Services Agency. So something for public health to consider: is it public health that has the authority to do this deeming, or is it something that we'd have to look to another state office to engage in? Here's an example from Maine. And this is a more general example, not specific to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. This statute states that it's the Maine Emergency Management Agency that has, or local organizations for emergency management. So emergency management specific agencies, but both at the state and local level, may employ any person considered necessary to assist with emergency management activities. So they, both emergency management at the state and local level, have the authority to deem non-state personnel as state employees. Any person who's called for and employed for assistance, either within Maine or deployed to another state, is deemed to be an employee of the state for purposes of immunity from liability and workers' compensation insurance. So you're deeming these non-state personnel emergency management personnel through the state. That would be a great tool to make them deployable through EMAC. It also has the similar language to EMAC, recognizing the professional license that the individual holds in their home state, recognizing that licensure in the state of Maine for the purposes of their services that they're providing for that emergency response. Another catch to pay attention to, though, is that the individual, the organization doing the deeming has to confirm that the license is valid for the purposes of providing these protections. And the last law I want to describe is the most recent of these examples. Last summer, Arizona passed this statute that regards or provides the ability to the governor, so paying attention who holds this power, it's the governor in Arizona, provides the governor the ability to regard individuals who are not state personnel as state personnel for specifically EMAC deployment purposes. So the statute provides that pursuant to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, the governor can deploy officers, employees of a private entity or a registered and credentialed volunteer organization in the state who will volunteer to provide assistance to an affected state experiencing a disaster that's duly declared by the governor of the affected state, tracking similarly to the language of EMAC for activation and use of that mutual aid agreement. The officers and employees are deemed emergency workers according to the state statute, considered agents of the requesting state for tort liability and immunity purposes, and are not going to be held liable for acts or omissions taken in good faith, as it is covered by Article 6 of the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So some quick conclusions before I pass it over to Holly to provide her firsthand experience with using the Emergency Management Assistance Compact and these kinds of legal issues that can come up. It's a uniform statutory system for states to deploy personnel. That uniformity can't be understated, nor can its advantages as a tool that's been practiced and implemented by many jurisdictions. Comfort with a legal authority or tool goes a long way in a jurisdiction's consideration as to whether or not to utilize that tool. Seeing it be used historically with such great success really helps jurisdictions come to the decision that yes, this is something we're going to use, we're going to utilize. Uniformity is important as well. There are, I think at last count, 18, maybe it might be up to 19 jurisdictions that have adopted the Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioners Act. Those jurisdictions who have that law or similar laws that allow deployment of non-governmental personnel that provide liability protections, licensure, reciprocity, workers' compensation coverage, those are certainly important, but they do lack for uniformity, even though that you in the Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioners Act might imply that the laws are uniform across state lines. There are some variations. There are different liability options that jurisdictions can choose when adopting the uniform law, and not all states that have adopted the uniform law have adopted all provisions of it, such as some jurisdictions have not adopted the workers' compensation coverage portions of the Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioners Act. What EMAC provides, unlike other statutory options, is uniform language and that level of comfort and familiarity with the processes and procedures that EMAC provides. It provides those important protections that really are fundamental to personnel deployment: licensure reciprocity, liability protections, and workers' compensation coverage. If you want to expand the individuals that you are able to deploy through EMAC beyond just your officers and employees of the state, you have to look to deeming authorities, either provided through statute or some other mechanisms that other jurisdictions have utilized to deploy non-state personnel through EMAC. So I want to do a very quick plug to our Public Health Emergency Law online training. It's a free course. Each section takes about 40 to 45 minutes. It's split into 3 units discussing systems preparedness and response, protections of persons, volunteers, and responders, and property and supplies. And within each one of these units are these interactive maps where you can click on your state to see your state's laws on emergency declarations, isolation and quarantine, liability protections, and emergency seizure of property within each one of those units. So please feel free to check it out. You've got a URL at the bottom of the page, and they are free to take. And so if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Holly.
All right, thank you. So I'm excited to be here today to present. I actually started as the attorney for Ohio EMA, and then EMAC is kind of what drew me over to take over an administrative position because of my experience working with it during 2016. So a little bit about Ohio is that we usually send resources outside the state. We're a resource-rich state, so we don't need to bring as many resources in. Our one exception was the Republican National Convention in Cleveland in 2016. My first slide here, if I can get it to go. There we go. So it was an interesting time period. It was, I think, February of 2016 that the city of Cleveland said we don't have enough law enforcement officers to really make the city safe during the Republican National Convention. And so it was our first experience in Ohio with a national special security event, our first experience realizing we didn't have enough resources, and we looked to EMAC, knowing that we had used it to send resources out, but can we now use it to bring the resources in, and how do we do that? So what happened was it took a lot of education really of our governor's office, and that's kind of one of my main points is, you know, you might adopt something into a law, but you have to constantly remind your elected officials and your administrative officials of what is in law and what the abilities are. So after we walked it through with them, talked about payment, who ultimately is going to pay the cost of bringing it in, because as it was mentioned, the reimbursement runs state to state. So even though the city of Cleveland might have the money to do it, we're still on the hook as the state of Ohio. So working that out with Cleveland. And then how do we get the resources in? Law enforcement had been deployed before using EMAC, not on as large a scale as what we needed though. So we looked at some lessons learned, and basically I kind of took it on as my own little passion project, put a pause on, you know, being the legal counsel, and kind of started doing all the EMAC stuff. And it was a big success for us. We were able to bring in over 1,000 troopers from 17 different states. And I have that news article up because it was one of the safest conventions in convention history, which was not what anyone thought going into it. So we were very happy with how it worked, and a lot of lessons learned that came out of it. But I bring it up because the big thing I think that it showed is you can use EMAC for a pre-planned event. So up until this point, I think there were talks, and maybe it was open for pre-planned events, but not really used. This was the first time that state had really used it for a pre-planned event, for a national special security event, a convention, and brought in the resources, which is important because more and more we see with protests and other disasters and man-made disasters going on, the need to do that for what is not traditionally a natural disaster that you think about using EMAC for. It also had a lot of lessons learned about, they mentioned previously with law enforcement, the power to arrest, and how do you grant them that authority? Well, Ohio is a home rule state. So we had to go back to the city of Cleveland, work with them. They had to dust out some ordinances from the early 1900s to even find out how to deputize all these people coming in. So it really brought up a lot of interesting lessons learned. And I think actually later that year is when North Dakota ended up using EMAC again for a pre-planned, not natural disaster event with their protest and brought in law enforcement. So that's kind of what got me excited about it. And then I started bugging the executive director of EMA about moving over and coming over to Ohio EMA. And so since then, I've come over and I do have EMAC under me and I can't help myself. So I do end up working it usually when we have our disasters. And I find it to be fascinating and something that continues to grow with interest. So moving on more specifically, I am going to talk a little bit about what I think Massachusetts was going to talk about since they weren't able to be on the call, and what Greg was talking about, which is how do you deploy private sector individuals? So Massachusetts has had success in doing this. I think in 2017, they sent down some nurses and doctors down to Puerto Rico to the US Virgin Islands, which was much needed at the time. So they are able to do it through their own sort of intergovernmental agreement that they do with the private entity to deploy them outside the state. Greg also mentioned a couple other states who have enabling legislation to do so. California, Arizona just passed it. I believe Nevada has similar legislation. We in Ohio, unfortunately, do not have that legislation, so we are not able to deploy private entities outside the state. What we can do in Ohio is state entities, which is contemplated by EMAC, and we can do local public entities. Our executive director has the ability under our Ohio Revised Code, our state law, to enter into agreements with other public entities. So we will do an intergovernmental agreement and we can send out local providers and local public entities to assist during EMAC. Unfortunately, with the medical professionals, we haven't had much success pulling state or local public officials who are nurses or doctors to send out. What we found in Ohio is that when we boiled it down, a lot of the nurses were contracted in private entities. So we have not had success yet in deploying any medical personnel outside the state, although it is something that I continue to push and work on. But I think, like Greg said, it really is state dependent. So each state looks and see if they have that enabling legislation or ability to send that private entity out of the state, if it's doctors or nurses, or even local entity outside the state. Same thing with volunteers. We in Ohio, don't send volunteers out through EMAC. There are other mechanisms for volunteers that can go through American Red Cross and other volunteer agencies, but we don't send it out through EMAC. So it's just a little bit about how that works for us. So assuming you can deploy your healthcare professionals out, what do they need to know and how does it work? So EMAC does state that licenses transfer. And so at first I thought, well, that's great, end of story, nothing else to talk about. And then I came to find out, I think it was with the 2017 deployments, and it might have been Louisiana, that there were issues popping up. And the issue is, well, a licensed practical nurse in Louisiana, what they can do is not the same as what an LPN can do in Puerto Rico. So yes, they will accept your license, but what does that license mean? So that was kind of a moment of stepping back and realizing when we craft requests to ask for individuals to come into our state, or when we're sending individuals out who are licensed, you really need to be specific. So the people who are working EMAC are like me. I have a degree in law and I have some experience, but I'm not a medical professional. So I don't know all the ins and outs of it. And it was a learning lesson for us that you really need to sit down with the subject matter expert when you're doing requests and offers and talk to them. What does a registered nurse in Ohio do? Well, let's just be very specific. If we're going to ask for them to come into Ohio and say, we want registered nurses, and in Ohio, it means they can do X, Y, and Z. That allows for the assisting state to look and see if what they have matches up. Or maybe it doesn't match up, but it's a different type of nurse in their state, and that's what they can offer. I think overall, a lesson that we are seeing come out of these past few disaster years is being just more specific about what you want, instead of just saying you want a type 4 team or a registered nurse, but really drilling down to what that means, because it does help with the offer and acceptance process. So that's kind of the first bullet point there, is being very careful crafting the request for medical professionals, for swiftwater rescue teams, whoever you are looking to bring in or send out of the state, to really make sure what they can do and what they're trained for matches up for what that state needs. Second bullet point is credentialing. I recently got to hear from an administrator at one of the hospitals in Las Vegas who was working during the shooting in 2017. It was really fascinating to hear about how the hospital stood up for the shooting, and in less than 24 hours, we're back to normal operations and everything they did. They did not need to use EMAC to bring in medical professionals, but the one thing they talked about that was kind of a trigger for me is that they still need the people who come in to be credentialed. So that's something that we have to think about as emergency management professionals. If we're asking for medical professionals to come in, and again, yes, we will accept your license, but what do they need to actually step foot into maybe the disaster zone to offer assistance, or in a hospital offer assistance? So you really have to start to work with your hospitals and your individuals there to make sure you're getting the badging and the credential for everybody who's coming in, so they're able to actually go into the hospital, go into the disaster zone, and do the work there. So that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, really, but it just, again, goes to show that in emergency management, you really have to work with your subject matter experts and be very specific and be very thoughtful about how you're bringing people in. Some other things, and just to think about, especially for healthcare professionals, think about before you're deploying. Do you need vaccinations where you're going? Do you have your health records ready? Are there health risks where you're deploying to? I believe it was during the 2017 deployments to Texas, there was a guardswoman from Pennsylvania who fell ill. And there was other people talking about how the standing water in Texas was just full of toxins and bacteria that were harmful to people. There is an ability to find out that information ahead of time, then we need to try to do that. Or if you're sending people out, they need to try to look and see what the risks are ahead of time, so they can get the vaccinations, they can get whatever they need to do before they deploy. Moving on. Another thing I was asked to talk about is sending equipment under EMAC. So it can be done. I think it would be rare that the equipment would travel by itself, because somehow it's going to have to get down there. So it's probably going to end up going with a person, even if really they only want the equipment. We've had one experience in Ohio in doing so, and it was an interesting one. So in 2017, our guard unit had its own equipment unit that was used as housing for other guards, men and women who were on, I believe, the Virgin Islands. So they sent it down. It was a whole logistical nightmare trying to even get it down there, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then once it was down there, it was used, and then it was time for it to come back, but it was obviously not the priority to get off the island. So it ended up sitting down there for several months and raised all kind of legal issues and reimbursement issues. So when you're thinking about sending equipment, you really have to think about how's it getting transported down there, doing inspections for it so you can tell if it's been damaged, and how are you getting it back off wherever it's going to. I mean, I think 2017 was just a big deal because it was islands, so moving things to islands was extremely difficult. But because of that, we had some good after action points, which helped me made up this slide. So one, you're gonna have a cost of an individual to accompany the equipment. You can put that in your offer when you send it down there. You're gonna have to think about what the cost of the equipment itself is. A lot of time equipment will have a daily usage fee, which is an easy way to track it. So, you know, for every day this piece of equipment's used, it costs X number of dollars, versus trying to track fuel and time, things like that. And then what is the actual cost for the equipment to be replaced? So a lot of times, if you ever start looking at the agreements to send equipment, they look extremely high, millions of dollars. And you're thinking, well, how is Puerto Rico going to reimburse Ohio $5 million for one unit? But the reason it looks that way is we put in the total cost of it just in case it gets damaged, as kind of a heads up to the requesting state or territory to let them know the total cost. When I talk to my fiscal people, they tell me they don't like that because it drives up the numbers and it makes it difficult really for that requesting state or territory to get a good estimate of how much they're spending on the disaster, because a lot of times the money is paid through FEMA, so they're trying to work all of that out. So, we try to look into that, but that is one thing with equipment. You send a helicopter down there, you send down these units that cost millions of dollars. If they do get damaged, as Angela talked about, they will get reimbursed fully. So how do you track that? Another thing with equipment for people to keep in mind is you need to be very careful with your resources, and this happened to us. A resource might start buying equipment while they're there, thinking, well, I need ladders or I need this or that to complete it. If they start doing that, more likely than not, they're not going to get reimbursed for it. So when it happened with us and we sent some troopers out to North Dakota and they started buying all this extra stuff, it was either you need to leave it with North Dakota and they'll pay you for it, or you're taking it home, but you can't just buy equipment while you're there. That's part of what goes into the offer process to begin with, is knowing what all they need to bring with them. So if they start buying stuff while they're there and the requesting state is not aware of it, they're not going to get reimbursed for it. So the issues with equipment, logistics of movement is huge. Logistics of movement was I think overall a huge issue in 2017. And with everything going on with the islands, trying to get things on and off of them was extremely difficult. One of our guard missions to send equipment was eventually rejected because it was going to take too long to get there. And when I asked, well, how's it moving? They said, well, we're going to have to rent a truck to drive it from Ohio over to New Jersey, then put it on a barge in New Jersey, then take it down to Puerto Rico. I mean, it was crazy, right? But I don't think anyone had really thought about how to move things up until that point across bodies of water. So now when we work, especially with our guard units, and we build what's called a mission ready package with them, we ask that question: how are you going to move this? It may seem like, well, that's only matters for islands, but it can matter here. Any of the fault lines that go will create an island of whatever state or area. So you have to think about moving things with helicopters, barges, whatever the case is, and how you're going to do that and the cost to do so. Storage and security of equipment. So you have this $1 million piece of equipment down there in a disaster zone. Who's looking after it? Does it need to be stored in a place that is out of the elements? These are things that we, as the people working the requests, need to ask to make sure that the equipment is going to be, safe and come back home. And then damage assessment, like I talked about. Before you leave, checking out the equipment to make sure everything's okay, documenting that. And then when it comes back, having it documented again, if everything's okay. Was our piece of equipment that was in Virgin Islands. At one point, the guard was trying to charge the Virgin Islands, I think, like the continual daily usage rate while it sat there for months. And I said, you can't do that, guys. It's not their fault that it's sitting there and you can't get it off the island. So we're just going to have to, eat the fact that it's there. But the reality is, with equipment, they're only asking for it for a certain period of time. So it does get difficult when you can't figure out how to move it off as quickly as you had wanted to. And so then just some other general EMAC considerations. So train and exercise often. Again, I'm sure you guys all see this too. There's elections every year, every other year, wherever state you're from, and you have new people in positions of power who are going to make the decisions. A governor needs to declare a state of disaster to open EMAC. Does your governor, your new governor's staff even know about EMAC and the options going into it? How do you educate them on them? A high level education of what it is, and how often do you have to remind them of it? Can you engage them? Can you engage the right individuals in your exercises? That's a big thing that we started to see in Ohio, and that we're starting to work on. If you try to, we tried doing this exercising EMAC from start to finish, and it was overwhelming. We had 2 full days to do it. But you have to keep working at it, keep refining your process, and trying to make it better, because that's the only way you can move forward. Preparing a mission ready package. So you want to be a resource that goes through EMAC. That's great. We want to send you. But the last thing you want to do is trying to call your human resource department at 2 a.m. to find out what your daily rate is because you want to deploy by 10 a.m. that day. So the reason we do mission ready packages is to try to get as much information as we can in advance to know how much it would cost us in that resource, to know your rates, to know estimates of what you would bring with you. and it really does help. We've had great success doing them. We had a swiftwater rescue team deploy in under 24 hours after the call came out last year because they had all of their paperwork in and documented. So I can't stress that enough. If you have any interest in it, then that is something that you work with your state emergency management agency on to get your paperwork in and update it yearly. Again, thinking about logistics of movement, I've already talked about that, and considering advanced teams. Another good best practice that I think we've seen is sending, if you think you're going to send a 15-person swiftwater rescue team or 25 law enforcement officers somewhere, how about you send 2 in advance to go down there and assess what's going on? And this was a really big deal with Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. We didn't really have a good awareness, a good situational awareness of what was happening. Where are people going to stay? Where are they actually going to work? Where can you get food? Where can you get fuel? If you send a smaller advanced team down, they can start laying the groundwork for that and feed the information back up through the national coordinating state that Angela talked about, and that can be shared with all of the rest of the states so that you know in advance where your team's staying overnight, where they can get food, where they can get fuel. So that's a big thing. And on that same note is communications. So it was not a surprise to me, I guess, when I heard that communications went down in Puerto Rico because we had been told they did not have a good structure to begin with. However, when I was told by a team we sent to Florida that they couldn't use their cell phones, there weren't communications, I was frankly floored by it, right? You wouldn't think that, but it does happen. Communication lines go down all the time. So you have to think about in advance, getting them satellite phones, getting them radios. You know, you really do have to think worst case scenario for where, because it's a disaster zone where you're sending people to. GIS and situational awareness. So again, the same thing, something that Angela and I and some of the other EMAC folks have been talking about is how do we harness technology to better do situational awareness? So an advanced team is great if you can do it, but maybe you can't send an advanced team down. Maybe the requesting state doesn't want to pay for it. But when you do have boots on the ground, how do we feed that information back? So GIS, Survey 123, these are all great tools that allow you to download an app on your phone, answer a couple quick questions. I'm here, I've gotten gas here, there's food available here. It maps it out for you so you can actually geolocate it and you can share that information with people. So kind of next steps for us as we continue to refine the process. Documentation for reimbursement. So when we did the RNC, you know, we did all the agreements, we brought everybody in, it was a success. And I thought, well, I'm gonna pat myself on the back and we're done. And then my fiscal people were like, we are far from done, because now you gotta worry about all the reimbursement stuff. And I did not even realize how much work that was and how much work they end up doing, years sometimes, to make sure all the documentation is there and that people are getting paid. And if you ask Angela, people can get reimbursed anywhere from 17 days after they've returned home to still waiting on reimbursements from 2017 deployment over 2 years later. So we are working on that. I know Angela and some of the other EMAC folks are working on that. But the best thing you can do in advance is to ask the questions of, what do I have to document? Ask that requesting state, what are your expectations? And so, do I need to document my hours? If so, what form do I need to use? Does somebody down there who now I'm under their operational control need to sign off on my daily logs, showing that I was out patrolling for 12 hours that day? Do credit card receipts work? You know, all of those questions, getting your fiscal people involved in advance, talking to their fiscal people so you can make the reimbursement process go as smooth as possible. So workers' compensation, this has already been talked about, that is owned by the home state. And so I thought that was an easy answer and didn't need to do much more work with it. But then I realized the complication is people get injured. So a team goes down to North Carolina from Ohio and they get injured down there and they don't think twice and they think they have to file in North Carolina. And then I come to find out in Ohio that we're one of the few states that if you do that, you're not going to get paid in Ohio and it's supposed to be paid out by Ohio. So we now have worked with our Bureau of Workers' Compensation and we try to educate all of our teams that leave here to know that it really is owned by Ohio. And that means that literally if you get injured outside the state, you still need to come back home and do the paperwork here. So, you know, can you engage your human resource department or whoever does your paperwork for you in advance, to let them know that you're deploying, to let them know, if you get injured, so they can start and do and track the paperwork for you. And then stay in contact and give feedback. So that's really a big deal. When teams deploy, we need to know what's going on with them. Things change. The agreement might need an amendment. Maybe you thought you were only going to be down there for 10 days. They need you for 15 days. And we want to get that amendment done as soon as possible to make sure everything's documented, and let us know how it goes. The more I talk to resources who are deployed, just the more you gain from it and the more you can help to refine your process. I think the latest one was this last hurricane that we had was unlike anyone that I had seen, and I haven't been doing this that long, but it sat over the Bahamas. So Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina were putting out requests. They were kind of lingering, they were canceling them. And so we had a team who wanted to go, and then all of a sudden they said, well, we can't go anymore, it doesn't work out. So taking the time to sit down with them and understand why that is and how to make it better, because as fire and in the fire world, they have to work shifts and they have to trade off shifts and do trade days if they're going to do a 2-week deployment. And at some point, if they keep delaying the deployment date, they're already eating into the days they agreed to work for somebody else. It was an educational experience for me, and it will help us in the future when we put in offers to be very clear about how long our offer is good for. So we always need to get feedback. We need to stay in touch. I think it's a rewarding experience. I myself have not deployed through EMAC, but everyone I've talked to who has not only felt like they accomplished something where they went, but they were able to bring back some best practices to their home state that has really helped their home state or their home jurisdiction. So I'm a big fan, as Angela knows. I often send her little hearts with EMAC in the middle of it. And I will always be a fan of it and continue to enjoy talking about it and learning more about it. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks also to Angela and Greg. Again, this is Matthew Penn here at CDC moderating today's panel. So at this time, I would like to invite you to ask any questions of the panelists related to their presentations, and I encourage you to take advantage of this time to ask our experts questions you may have on your mind. There is a Q&A box located in your Zoom world. In mine, it is sort of in a band of functions down at the bottom of the screen, and you can type your question in there, and then I can coordinate getting that to the right person. And if you have a question for a particular panelist, either Angela, Greg, or Holly, if you could indicate that in your question, I could get it to the right person. And again, we originally had 4 panelists in today's presentation, but one of our colleagues was called to the Emergency Operations Center for a response up in the Northeast. So we probably will end a little bit early, but now is certainly a great time to answer questions you may have. I have a question for Angela. Angela, with the most EMAC experience of anyone in the country, what is the single most important lesson that you have learned through your experiences?
Just truly how humbling this situation is. I mean, from where I stand, I'm not a state. I oversee the whole entire process. I see what the states do, and everything from, when you look at a resource and the logistical requirements and everything that goes into a deployment, to leaving their family for usually 2 weeks at a time to go and serve in another state, to going into very inhospitable conditions usually, and then conducting your mission, and then traveling home, putting the reimbursement together. It's a very humbling experience to see the states. And I mean, you've got the Hollies who put a lot of effort into it, and she's not the one deploying, but every small little piece that comes together to make the system work, I think, is for me, the biggest lesson learned, because it's not just about the people deploying. It's about the people who are making the requests in the state. It's about the people at the local level who need that resource. It's about the families at home that are letting their family member go on that deployment. So for me, I think it was really eye-opening to kind of put all the pieces together and to see how the entire system works. And quite frankly, I find it incredibly humbling to be the person that helps to coordinate the entire process, feel very inadequately capable of someone to have such an honor to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. And Holly, in your presentation, you talked a good bit about mission-ready packages.
Yes.
And we have a question here about, I believe this is, could you give examples of public health mission-ready packages and what is required with those packages?
So I would say for public health, what we have seen the most need for is ambulance strike teams, nurses, all different levels of nurses, and mental health. So those are the big things. And I think we've had a lot of struggle filling the mental health ones too. To do the mission ready package, you would work with whatever state EMA you're in, but it might look overwhelming. It's actually pretty simple. It's an Excel spreadsheet and it has tabs and you fill it out. And one tab is listing the personnel who are going and their rate of pay and their rate for overtime and their rate for fringe benefits. So that's something that, you would probably have to go back and work with your human resources department to get. And then it does have how many hours you're working a day. That's just a guesstimate and something you would have to tweak when it came time to actually do the mission, but we usually tell people to put in 12-hour days. One note on that, and something I forgot to mention, is listing of names. There were some issues with individuals who deployed to North Dakota just because there was a political issue. So we are sensitive to that now. If it's a politically sensitive situation people are deploying to, you don't have to put in the name, right away, especially for a mission ready package. That's something that can be filled in later. Another tab will have you list equipment. So, if you are a medical team, unless you have a lot of equipment to bring with you, you're probably going to just fly down for transportation. But if you have a lot of equipment, you would list it there, your medical supplies, things like that. And then another tab for transportation, and then one for miscellaneous and incidentals. Incidental things like personal things like deodorant, that is not reimbursed under EMAC, but you might list for laundry care or things like that if you're going to be gone for 2 weeks and you need to wash your clothes, especially if you're wearing a uniform. So it's something that once you sit down and do it and you get it done once, it's pretty easy to update annually and pretty easy to update on the update when the actual request comes in. So that team that we had, the Swiftwater Rescue Team, I think they had a 16-person team. They did their mission ready package. It was ready to go. When the request came in, they just had to update how many days they would be gone, the distance they were traveling for their mileage, and then they were ready to go, and we were able to get it in the system and process pretty quickly.
Great, thank you so much. And Greg, I have a bit of a compound question here. So how might an emergency management agency and a health department have different roles when it comes to deploying non-state personnel via EMAC? And another participant asked about, what about volunteers deployed through EMAC that are not considered officers or employees?
Sure, absolutely, I can answer that. And I'll answer the second one first because that leads me into the first question. So the second question was, what about volunteers deployed through EMAC that aren't considered officers or employees? That's the rub. That's the primary issue that we wanted to speak to for my presentation, and it was a major question that we get. You can't deploy personnel through EMAC unless you've somehow deemed them to be officers or employees of the sending state. Now you have those statutory mechanisms that I've described, but other jurisdictions have used memorandums of understanding or memorandums of agreement with either individuals or entities to deploy those non-state personnel, to deem them to be officers or employees of the state, thus making them deployable through EMAC. That's how you get a person into EMAC and make them deployable, is find some way to make them an officer or employee. In our preparations with Sam from Massachusetts, who you've heard it a number of times already, we are very dearly missing on this webinar. She mentioned that when Massachusetts has deployed non-state personnel, they've done it through MOUs, but they can only do it through MOUs with entities, not with individuals. So they have to find an organization that they're going to then deem the employees of that organization or the volunteers for that entity to be state personnel, thus making them deployable through EMAC. I know during New York's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, they used an MOU with Bellevue Hospital to deem the hospital employees, the nurses and doctors, employees or officers of the sending state of New York, to then make them deployable through EMAC to Puerto Rico. So you have to find that mechanism, and it's a best way to do that is discussions with your attorneys to see, is there a statute we can rely upon, like we saw in Arizona and Maine, to deem volunteer state personnel and make them deployable through EMAC, or can we utilize an MOU, MOA, or some other kind of contracting mechanism to make that happen. To your first question, Matthew, emergency management versus public health department for deploying non-state actors. That's a big issue. That's a big challenge. I made a point to highlight those spots in those statutes that I showed examples of, who has the authority to do the deeming. And in all the examples that I provided, the deeming authority is given either to the governor or the emergency management agency. Now, when you're doing a public health response, and especially when we're talking about things like licensure reciprocity, it's the health department usually, or whatever, health agency that regulates the practice of medicine or healthcare in your jurisdiction that's going to have the data on health systems. Now, some jurisdictions have utilized the emergency systems for the advanced registration of volunteer health professionals in their jurisdiction to at least catalog the licensure and credentialing status of individuals in their jurisdictions, and you can use that to vet and verify. Now, that information then needs to be dictated and provided to the emergency management agency or whatever entity it is, if it's the governor's authority to do so, who has the authority to do the deeming. But there is one really important point that I want to make, and that's actually a new law that was passed this past winter under the 2019 update to the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act. In the 2019 update, Congress included a section, and it's codified at 42 USC 234. So kind of easy to remember, 234, 42 USC 234, and it's entitled Healthcare Professionals Assisting During a Public Health Emergency. Now, it has a pretty specific purpose. What it does is it limits venue. And by venue, I mean where someone can file a lawsuit. What this federal law does, and it expressly preempts any state law, is it says that if you're a healthcare professional and you're enrolled in a state's medical reserve corps or emergency system for the advanced registration of volunteer health professionals, which I need to note relevant to the question is specifically run by a health department, then if you're deployed to another state and that state is the recipient of a federal public health emergency declaration by the HHS secretary, or a presidential declaration under the Stafford Act or National Emergencies Act, and that person's alleged to have injured someone, and they were acting within the scope of things they were asked to do pursuant to their deployment, and they're acting within the scope of their license as their license is defined in their home state. So that speaks to the question that that Holly mentioned about different licensure levels in different jurisdictions. The way this federal law works is you can only be doing those things that are within the scope of your home's license, which is also then going to be recognized in the other state. Then you can only be sued in the state where the injury occurred. So to sum up, if you're registered in MRC or ESAR VIP system, you're deployed to a state that's received a federal emergency declaration by either the HHS Secretary or the President, and you're acting within the scope of your home's license while you're deployed to that other state, then an injured person can only sue you in the state in which you're responding. They can't turn around and sue you in your home state where you normally engage in your healthcare practice, your healthcare profession. It limits where those lawsuits can be filed. But when we think about the differences between emergency management agencies and public health agencies, it's important to consider that registration in a health department run system is a prerequisite for this specific protection, and is a prerequisite for a number of other protections as well. But the deeming authority might be held by the emergency management agency. So that's why cooperation, coordination is really, really fundamental when we're talking about deploying non-state actors through EMAC.
And Greg, these alternative mechanisms of deeming outside of statutory authority, is that one way jurisdictions could deal with potentially limitations in workers' compensation coverage for non-state volunteers?
That I'm not sure on. I mean, outside of the examples that I mentioned, which were MOUs, MOAs, and Holly, please chime in if you have any thoughts on this. I don't know of any other mechanisms besides legislative authority to deem, or an MOU, MOA to deem. But if your existing state's workers' compensation coverage is inadequate, there really isn't much you can do outside of changing the provision of workers' compensation in your state to make up for that inadequacy. And it's going to be a big challenge, and it's whether or not you're planning on even covering volunteers with your workers' comp system through an EMAC deployment could greatly affect your, the premiums that you pay to the organization that provides workers' compensation insurance to your state. So that is a major challenge. Holly, anything to add?
Yeah, so I'll speak to Ohio. It's a little bit of an interesting system that we have in Ohio. We do have a provision in our revised code that does cover volunteers for workers' comp who are assisting during a disaster. We also have provisions who cover volunteers for liability purposes in disasters. We used to be under our National Guard, so it's buried in that side of the house, and they would actually end up paying for it. It's kind of an oddity. But to qualify for it, you have to take this kind of antiquated oath from back in the day, and then you have to have somebody track that you're a volunteer and you're under an emergency manager and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's an interesting question. It's a case-by-case basis for sure in every state. But like Greg said, if your state doesn't have some sort of odd, I kind of think it's like an oddball provision like we have that really is from back when we were under the National Guard, you would have to find a way to do the coverage. I think what you will find, maybe not for workers' comp, but definitely for liability, most states, because I've separately have looked into it, do protect people who volunteer for liability reasons during disasters. There's usually some other provision in that state that does protect them. The workers' comp piece, maybe not as much. We do have it in Ohio. However, when I've talked to our bureau about it, I don't think anyone's actually used it, which is, a good thing. No one's gotten injured, I guess, assisting during a disaster. But we do have a mechanism, but it certainly is very much a case-by-case basis.
Great, thank you all so much. And thank you so much again to our distinguished panel. This concludes this portion of the webinar. I'd like to thank all our panelists for sharing with us very interesting and useful information. Your contributions are valuable to all of those who joined us today, and we really, really do appreciate your time and spending time and your expertise with us. Finally, I would like to let our audience know about the next webinar, and you can see some info up here on the screen. The next webinar in the series, which will examine challenges public health professionals and responders are facing during the Ebola response, as well as currently legal provisions and concepts and how they apply them to future infectious diseases. And this webinar will be held on November 21st, 2019, from 2 p.m. until 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and is entitled Ebola and Beyond, legal preparedness for outbreaks. Just as with the first webinar in this series, this webinar was recorded and it will be posted at nga.org or nga.org/webinars, one word, WEBINARS. So with that, I will, as a moderator and having that authority vested in me, I will close us out for today. And thank you again to Angela and to Greg and to Holly for spending time with us and sharing great information with us about EMAC, which is really just an amazing mechanism for mutual aid in the United States of America. So thank you all so much. And with that, we will sign off.